Welcome to the second Popular STEAM Talk today as part of GPC's 60s Symposium here at Clarkson campus and online. I'm Ulrike Lahaise, the coordinator of the Popular STEAM Talk series. I'm also teaching astronomy and honors astronomy online. Wearing these two hats gave me the opportunity to pose the 60s space race as a theme for research papers to my honors astronomy class last semester. Today, I'm honored to show a collection of several brief voice-over PowerPoint presentations by my honors students from last semester that cover various aspects of the 60s space race. The student presentations were only edited for duration and uniform presentation style. A little bit of content was trimmed here and there, but none of the content was altered. The opinions stated by my students are purely their own. I want to give a shout out to my daughter Corinne, a ninth grader at Brookwood High School. She graciously gave me a crash course in PowerPoint animations and slide transitions. Without her help, I would not have been able to bring all presentations into a uniform slideshow format because they had all kinds of transitions and starts and stops of audio on click and not on click, so it was quite interesting. The sequence of topics and speakers today, we will start out with the space race by Lila Yankovsky, then the Soviet space race by Ricky Mobley, the Apollo project by Chana Lipschitz, the effect of the space race on American culture by Malka Deutsch, the Moon is a Harsh Mistress by David Fortney will be the final presentation. I will briefly introduce each speaker before I will start their presentations. So, we'll go for launch. Fasten your seatbelts. The first talk today is the space race by Lila Yankovsky. A little bit about Lila. Her major is social work, and she is currently a sophomore here at GPC and plans on graduating this spring. As a career, she wants to become a counselor and yoga therapist. Lila chose astronomy because she has always been in awe of the universe, its massiveness, and that so much of it is unexplored and unknown. She will start out with a presentation about our understanding of the space race. So this will be a general overview.
Hello, my name is Layla Jankowski, and today I will be speaking with you about the space race. The space race was a competition for technological superiority of spaceflight between the United States and Russia that took place between the years of 1955 through 1972. The catalyst for this race came when the United States announced on July 29, 1955, that they would be launching artificial satellites into space. The Soviets countered by announcing just 4 days later that they would do the same. On October 4, 1957, the Soviets beat America to the punch with the successful launch of Sputnik 1, the first human-made object ever put into space. Over the course of the next several years, the U.S. and the Soviets attempted to rival each other with space technology and space missions. On April 12, 1961, the Soviets stepped up the competition to pull further ahead of the U.S. when a Russian cosmonaut named Yuri Gagarin became the first human being in orbit. Over the next year, Russia continued to pull further ahead of the United States in space missions. Among some of the accomplishments they could boast about was the first dual-man spaceflight, putting the first woman into space, the first three-man mission, and completing the first spacewalk. During this time, many citizens of the United States viewed Russia as an enemy that was beating America in the space race. Realizing that they needed a major advancement to pull ahead of Russia, NASA scientists began focusing on a huge mission. On May 25, 1961, President John F. Kennedy put the world on notice. America was committing to landing on the moon by the end of the decade. This declaration was followed by a major increase in funding and the implementation of a multi-billion-dollar project called the Apollo Lunar Program. By 1966, 4.5% of the federal budget was spent towards NASA's efforts. The U.S. knew that accomplishing this feat would put America ahead in the space race. America's spacecraft, Apollo 11, successfully landed on the moon on July 20th, 1969. As 600 million people around the world tuned in, Neil Armstrong walked on the moon and uttered the now famous phrase, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." By the early 1970s, the government began taking less and less interest in space missions as the cost for them was literally astronomical. The space race was over. Funding of space missions dropped to 1% of the federal budget by the time of fiscal year 1975. Since the time of the space race, the United States did not completely abandon space endeavors. In 1973, the first U.S. space station, Skylab, was launched, as well as the Space Shuttle program of 1981, which was in operation for 30 years. Several robotic missions continue to this day to explore the solar system. To this day, the United States is the only country to have successfully put humans in orbit beyond Earth. However, more countries are investing in their space programs with goals of putting people into orbit, particularly India and China. China has made incredible strides in space technology within the past 10 years and have a goal to build a space station on the moon by the year 2020. India launched the Mars Orbiter mission, an unmanned spacecraft, in 2013, and it has been orbiting Mars since September of 2014. With all of this interest internationally, the United States has been feeling some pressure to step up their international space exploration game. However, NASA faces some challenges due to aging equipment and a federal budget that devotes 20% to national security since the increase of terrorism. Most experts agree that the United States needs to maintain leadership in space exploration and position itself as the world leader in space once again. The current administration agrees, and in 2010, U.S. President Barack Obama committed to increase NASA funding by $6 billion over 5 years. On April 15, 2010, at a major space policy speech at Kennedy Space Center, Barack Obama predicted a U.S. crewed orbital Mars mission by the mid-2030s. Since the time of the space race, Americans have looked to exploring the universe in not only competitive terms with other countries, but also as a way to more deeply understand the beginnings of our solar system. While our country has demonstrated the need to have a competitive edge in space, the U.S. has worked side by side with scientists all over the globe for the greater good of science.
Okay, now that Lila gave us a pretty good overview of the space race and the U.S. side of the space race, let's have the Soviet space race by Ricky Mobley paint a little picture of what the Soviet side of the space race was like. Here's a little bit of info about Ricky. He's a communication major in his sophomore year at UPC, and he plans to graduate in fall 2015. Ricky chose astronomy because life beyond Earth is amazing to him. Not just human life, but any kind of life. To him, the makeup of our universe is an amazing gift left for us to explore. So, without further ado, here is his presentation about the Soviet space race.
After World War II, the United States of America and Soviet Union were not done with the battle. Only this time, they would take their battle to technology. Back then, technology was a slow learning process. The more you knew, the more power you had. With that in the minds and the hearts of the two nations, a race between the Soviet Union and the United States was bestowed upon us. The intensity of the space race between the United States and Soviet Union was led by Sergei Korolev, who was a self-proclaimed engineer. During the earlier stages of the space race, the Soviet Union created the Sputnik 1. The Sputnik 1 served as the first artificial Earth satellite. The picture you see is a replica of the Sputnik 1. You can see in detail how small and precise this craft was. It was only 53 centimeters in diameter. The Soviet Union launched the Sputnik 1 on October 4, 1957. With this spacecraft, scientists were able to gather a lot of information about the ionosphere. After 3 months of orbit, the spacecraft fell and burned into pieces. This was just the start of what would be an ongoing race between the United States and the Soviet Union. Russia's feelings on Sergei Korolev seem to be up in the air. According to Sergei Khrushchev, Korolev was not a scientist, not a designer. He was a brilliant manager. Korolev's problem was his mentality. And quote, Korolev didn't adapt to the idea of working in stages, rather to just assemble everything and take it from there. Under that kind of guidance, there were numerous failures, particularly of ruining. The idea of sending the man to the moon started to become more complicated. Some felt that it was doomed from the start. The beginning stages of training started with dogs. Small dogs were confined to small boxes for 15 to 20 days at a time, as pictured. While some of us may look at this as animal cruelty, it was indeed a tool to help further our information and create space capsules suitable for humans. The choice of dogs were usually stray dogs. This was because they did not want to use dogs accustomed to standard living conditions in homes or with families. They also chose female dogs because of their temperament. The design of the spacesuits for the dogs were designed around female dogs. The training for these dogs included various types. One included the dog standing for long periods of time in a simulator in their spacesuits. The simulation included accelerated rocket launches. Some dogs were even flown into orbit with bubble helmets strapped on. At about 100 kilometers, dogs were in orbit and fed jelly-like protein. The dogs that survived the orbit were reported to have suffered from constipation. These dogs eventually became a symbol of heroism. Some of these dogs were put on stamps as a symbol of appreciation and acknowledgement. The training of these dogs meant that the Soviet Union could prepare humans to orbit space. The race as we know it was led by the Soviet Union. On April 12, 1961, they were the first to have a person orbit Earth. This person being Yuri Gagarin, who became the first cosmonaut to travel in Vostok 1. The Vostok 1 was a small spherical spacecraft. One would even wonder how anyone can comfortably fit inside and be able to work accordingly. In orbit, Yuri had no control over the spacecraft. Everything was controlled through the computers on Earth. The Vostok 1 consisted of an ejection seat as well as a life support system. The ejection seat was designed to eject Yuri Gagarin at 7 kilometers so that he would be able to return to Earth by parachute. The spacecraft was able to orbit for about 2 hours at a maximum altitude of 203 miles before landing in Kazakhstan. Reports also show that Yuri was able to eject himself and land back on Earth without the spacecraft. Yuri Gagarin was only 27 when he took the brave voyage in Vostok 1. Born in Russia, Yuri always had a fascination with flying. He graduated from the Russian Air Force with honors in 1957. In 1959, he had been selected for cosmonaut training. His one and only space mission on Vostok 1 helped title him the hero of Soviet Union. Unfortunately, in 1968, Yuri was killed in a crash during a training mission. Today, Yuri is still noted as a prominent historical figure. With the Soviet Union having the title under their belts as the first country to have a man orbit space, the race undoubtedly belonged to them. While the United States of America had the Apollo program, the Soviet Union was already a few steps ahead of them. During the 1970s, the United States of America was able to succeed by putting the first man on the moon, which was Neil Armstrong. But that was only after the Soviet Union had already created the trend. So who won the space race? Looking at the chart, we see that the United States were able to push out more spacecraft launched than the Soviet Union was able to. In the grand scheme of things, the continued race seems to have more accomplishments in the United States of America's favor. But how does one measure the success of the race? Do we base our measures on quantity or quality of the mission? With the Soviet Union being able to devise a plan, first implies that they were years ahead of the United States of America as far as technology. Their programming systems and engineering seemed to be ahead of its time, while the United States of America caught up at a much later time. It would only be an opinion to say who won the space race, but in my opinion, I would say the Soviet Union.
Okay, so now we've heard it from both sides, and let's dive a little bit deeper into the Apollo project, which was the main project with the biggest accomplishment in the 60s that put a man onto the moon. So now let's listen to Chana, and I'm going to give you a little bit of information about her. She's a dual enrollment student here at GPC, coming from Tenino High School for Girls. In her introduction, she posted at the beginning of fall semester that she was born and bred in Atlanta. She loves going to the beach and spending time with her family and friends. Chana also enjoys music and arts and was looking forward to learn more about the universe. And I'd like to think that she did. Her presentation deals specifically with the Apollo project and some of its most important technological spin-offs for our society.
NASA's famed Apollo project from 1960 to 1972. On September 12, 1962, John F. Kennedy, America's 35th president, announced to his nation and the world, "We choose to go to the moon." Beginning of America's dream to land a man on the moon.
We choose to go to the moon and this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
Apollo 1 and its tragedy. Apollo 1 was to be the first ever manned crew to orbit Earth. The crew consisted of Commander Pilot Edward White, Commander Virgil Gus Grissom, and Pilot Roger Chaffee. Their scheduled launch was to be February 21st, 1967, but sadly enough, the rocket never got to leave the ground. Weeks of training behind the astronauts, and only 1 month before the takeoff, there was a tragedy on board the stationary command module. During the pre-flight training, a fire broke out due to a spark from a short circuit. The fire easily spread among the oxygen-filled environment and among all the flammable materials. It took around 90 seconds to open the hatch to get out of the command module and flee, but the astronauts were killed after 30 seconds of trying. This mission was to be known as one of the worst tragedies in the history of Apollo 5. This was the first test flight of the lunar module. The lunar module was a vehicle that was directly meant to operate and run outside of Earth's environment. The lunar module would be the craft that would carry the astronauts to the moon's surface. The mission's objective was to validate the ascent and descent of the lunar module and its spacecraft structure. This mission was launched on January 22nd, 1968. Apollo 5 was a success and it verified the lunar module system and its capabilities. It was left in space to orbit and eventually disintegrate on its own. Apollo 6. This was the last unmanned Apollo mission. Apollo 6's objectives were to confirm the launch roads, verify stage separation, guidance control, and to check out the control module recovery. Sadly enough, a few problems popped up during this mission. The first problem to come up was a Saturn V went through a pogo oscillation, which is a potentially severe combustion in the rocket fuel. Luckily, it did not damage the actual structure of the rocket. Another issue that occurred because of fault in its manufacturing was that the panels from the lunar module fell off. And the final problem that happened was that the second stage had 5 engines involved and had 2 of its engines shut down prematurely. That was a very big issue. The mission ended without the completion of the Earth's orbit, and the command module was found 80 miles off target. By Apollo 7, NASA was finally confident enough to once again send a crew into space. The crew consisted of Walter M. Schirra, the commander, Don F. Eisel, the command module pilot, and Walter Cunningham, the lunar module pilot. Apollo 7's objectives were to test the functioning of the command and service module, the crew, the launch performance, and its support facilities. From Apollo 7, NASA would learn to train astronauts not to wear their helmets when descending because of the pressure. Apollo 7 was a success and returned to Earth on October 12, 1968. Apollo 8 was the first Apollo mission to successfully orbit the moon. It was launched on December 21, 1968, and it returned successfully on December 27, 1968. Through this mission, Apollo's command module was tested, and when returning from the mission, NASA acquired pictures of future landing sites for other Apollo missions. Apollo 8 did not have a lunar module with it. Apollo 8 was significant because for the first time, it allowed mankind to see Earth as the beautiful sphere it is. Apollo 9 was launched on March 3, 1969. Its mission's objectives were to test the lunar module, to test the maneuvers that would be used in the actual lunar mission that involved landing a spacecraft on the moon. Apollo 10, launched on May 18, 1969, was the first to travel to the moon with the full Apollo spacecraft, consisting of a command and service module and the lunar module. This was to be the practice run for future Apollo missions that would land on the moon, including Apollo 11. Apollo 10 gathered the appropriate information needed for landing the lunar module, verified the Saturn V's safety, and assured the mission's success in landing a man on the moon. Apollo 11 was one of the most exciting moments in American history. On July 16, 1969, at Kennedy Space Center, the Saturn V SA-504 was launched. The famous crew involved with this mission was Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, and Buzz Aldrin. Armstrong was the commander, Collins was the commander module pilot, and Aldrin was the lunar module pilot. Just as past as another Apollo mission, the Saturn V ran smoothly and the lunar module landed on the moon's surface on July 20th at 4:17 with 40 seconds p.m. in Mare Tranquillitatis, known as the Sea of Tranquility. The landing of the lunar module had some difficulty, but succeeded in the hands of Neil Armstrong. Neil Armstrong was the first man ever to step foot on the moon's surface, saying the words that is known in every generation. That's one small step for man and one giant leap for mankind. Apollo 11's crew placed on the moon a plaque carved on it, saying, meant from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon, July 1969 AD, we came in peace for all mankind. The crew brought samples back from the moon's surface for scientists to test and evaluate. President Kennedy stated, "For every American, this has to be the proudest day of their life. NASA has finally reached their goal." Apollo 12 was also a successful moon landing mission that landed on the moon's surface on November 19, 1969. One objective of the mission has been to learn more about the Surveyor 3. The Surveyor 3 was an unmanned spacecraft that had landed on the moon 2.5 years before. They gathered information on the Surveyor 3 and returned to Earth on November 24th. Apollo 13 is another well-known spacecraft that had a major complication that caused it to be an incomplete mission. It was launched on April 11, 1970, and another name for it was the Odyssey. The goal of the mission was to explore the moon's surface in order to find other good landing places for future Apollo missions. What caused the incompletion was an explosion in an oxygen tank that had been damaged in a test run-through and no one had realized. This resulted in other small damages, and the crew had to switch over to the lunar module and put the command module on low power. The crew tried their best to fix the problem and eventually had to just return back to Earth and thankfully landed on April 17, 1970. Apollos 14, 15, and 16 all landed successfully on the moon. Each mission landed on different areas of the moon, allowing there to be a wider expanse of knowledge about the moon's surface. These missions brought back a lot of pictures and samples of the moon's surface for scientists on the Earth to study and evaluate. The final Apollo mission was Apollo 17, and it was named America, launching on December 7, 1972. This was the last mission ever to have a man on the moon. The crew consisted of Eugene Cernan as commander, Ronald Evans as commander module pilot, and Harrison Schmitt as lunar module pilot. With Eugene Cernan, he would forever be known as the person to hold the last person to be on the moon's surface, as no human has ever visited the moon since December 14, 1972. This last Apollo mission was a victorious closing chapter in American history of the Apollo mission. Many people don't realize that they have a major connection with the Apollo missions even today through technology. The spacesuits that astronauts wore were called cooling suits, and we still use them today for race car drivers, nuclear reactor technicians, and shipyard workers. These suits kept astronauts' body temperature healthy while in space and were comfortable while walking on the moon. The very same chemical process developed by NASA for the Apollo project is used today in kidney dialysis. Solar panels that we use today for cars, water heating, and many more appliances originally was developed for the Apollo lunar module. Athletes today may not realize that the athletic shoes they're wearing on their feet actually originated from the moon boot that was worn on the moon's surface. The moon boot helps with the impact and control of the astronauts walking on the moon's surface. All of this technology has changed our lives and our world forever. The food that the astronauts ate, known as freeze-dried food, is used today in the United States Army. Just like the astronauts from the Apollo missions needed the correct amount of nutrients and vitamins, so does our Army. Communication between the Earth and the astronauts in space was essential for the Apollo mission. Telephone companies benefited greatly from the mass communication improvements developed for these missions. One of the most important developments from the Apollo project was the computer development. Scientists came up with a way to minimize the size of the computers to fit onto a spacecraft. This technology changed the entire industry of computers forever. All of this technology has changed our lives and our world forever. The Apollo project accomplished 3 Earth orbiting missions, 2 lunar orbiting missions, a lunar swingby, and 6 moon landing missions. This was incredible. By dreaming big, man could go far, even if it's to the moon. The Apollo missions will be forever known as the Golden Age.
Okay, so now we have a pretty good picture about the hallmark mission of the 60s space race. And here is Malka now, spending a little bit more time of talking about the effect of the space race on the American culture. Malka is also a dual enrollment student from Jemima High School for Girls, and she lives in Atlanta. According to the introduction she posted at the beginning of the fall semester, she also received a driver's license. She loves being with friends and family. Her hobby is sports, and she roots for all the Atlanta teams. She was looking forward to an enjoyable semester, and I'd like to think that she really did have one. Malka's presentation will explore the effect of the space race on American culture, such as politics, education, literature, TV, film, etc.
The effects of the space race on American culture by Malka Ditch. The Cold War was from 1945 to 1991. It was between the Soviets and the United States. After World War II, there was some tension between the 2 superpowers, between communist Soviets and the capitalist United States, and they were fighting for that status of either communist or capitalist. There was no real direct fighting between the 2, but there was regional wars like the Vietnam War, Korean War, and Afghanistan wars. Also, there was big threat of nuclear warfare. The space race was really from 1955 to about 1975. It was an ideological and technological fight. Technological and scientific superiority translated into military strength. There was fought in space, and the victories were new steps into space exploration. The space race really started when the Soviets launched Sputnik on October 4th, 1957. They also sent the first man, Yuri Gagarin, to space in April of 1961. At that point, the Americans were worried about advancing and losing in the space race. So they sent a couple weeks later Alan Shepard to space, and he was there in May of 1961. The Soviets also sent the First Lady, Valentina Tereshkov, to space on June 16, 1963. The United States really triumphed in that they sent the first man ever to land on space. On July 20, 1969, Neil Armstrong walked the moon for the very first time. The space race really concluded with the Apollo-Soyuz test project in July of 1975. This was the first international human spaceflight mission and really symbolized the détente period between the 2 superpowers. Politics were also affected by the space race. The possibility of advancing and working in space came up in President Dwight Eisenhower's term. During his term of influence in 1958, Congress created NASA. Although he was not an advocate, he definitely realized that it was a necessity for the war. But it was extremely expensive to get a guy in space. In 1960, Eisenhower approved the plan to accelerate the Saturn super booster program called Apollo, which would hypothetically build rockets big enough to launch a manned satellite to the moon. But when Big Joe, an Atlas missile carrying the first Mercury capsule, failed, things went pretty much downhill. Eisenhower then decided that instead of being civilian scientists, as initially planned, that has to be governmentally employed and powered. Time was passing, and there were still no results. And every project was becoming very expensive. After almost a year, Eisenhower actually cut NASA's budget, and his committee became very unsympathetic to their issues. He also cut the second stage of the Saturn program by saying that further tests and experiments will be necessary to establish if there are any valid scientific reasons for extending manned spaceflight beyond the Mercury program, because the Mercury program could lead to nothing. This cut really was significant because of what it implied. He kind of was saying that he didn't believe in their success and the thought that NASA was a minor project that could be left to the side. Our next president, John F. Kennedy, really used the space race to help him become president. In 1960, he complained about the missile death, and he blamed it on the past president and his wife. The idea started when the Soviets launched Sputnik, and the Americans were still not able to match it. Kennedy assured the people that he would help support and encourage NASA, but he never actually said what the space program would be. Once Kennedy was president, he became less enthusiastic and eager. He did not believe that manned spaceflight should be part of this new frontier program because of the risk and the extreme expense. After MR1, an unmanned Mercury capsule failed, most Americans were worried about how Kennedy would react. They were kind of right. Kennedy was even thinking about closing down the National Aeronautics Space Council, which was the go-between for the president and NASA. Thankfully, his vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, was a big supporter of NASA, and he took the chairman role after Eisenhower. He had said as early as 1958 that control of space is control of the world. Morale at NASA was pretty low, and when Yuri Gagarin in March of '61 reached space, many people, Americans, were blaming the president. They said, we could have done it a month ago if someone on the top just decided to push it. Kennedy realized at that point that it was time to get some results and called a meeting where he and his team agreed that the only way to catch the Soviets would be to join together. Although it was a great cost and effort, they realized that there was nothing more important. He said we should commit to Congress in 1961 that we should commit ourselves to achieve the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning himself safely back to Earth. Once Kennedy joined with NASA, results became a little bit faster. Alan Shepard went and John Glenn orbited Earth in Friendship 7. Kennedy was determined to really reach the moon, although it was not accomplished in his lifetime. His leadership was really undeniable. He had said in September of 1962, we need to lead the exploration of space for all the eyes of the world. Look into space, into moon, into planets beyond, and we have vowed that we shall not be governed by a hostile flag of conquest, but by a banner of freedom and peace. As he himself put it, the nation had tossed its cap to the wall of space, and we have no choice but to follow it. The next president, President Lyndon B. Johnson, really was a supporter for as long as NASA existed. In 1958, he really pressured Eisenhower to start NASA, and when he was vice, he held the chairman role for the council. When he was president, he continued with the program, and NASA continued to strive. In 1964, he says, I don't believe that this generation of Americans is going to resign itself to go in a Betty Schnitt by the light of a communist moon. He and the people were determined to make an impact and to have some innovations for the moon. The education was also impacted because of the space race. Congress passed the National Defense Education Act of 1958, which mandated funding for better math and science curriculums in schools. NASA started and had, according to its deputy administration, Hugh L. Dryden, a program that started with physics and math and has led to stimulation in electronics, communication, and energy theories, etc. Due to the popularity of NASA and its success in the 60s, many civilians became interested in science and astronomy. This increased the demand of studies to the point where Congress had to step in the picture and appease everybody's newfounded hunger for science, engineering, and math. In this graph, it sees the amount of 15, 16, and 17-year-olds going to school. In the 60s, it was a good percent, but in the 70s, it decreased even more. The film industry completely shifted towards science fiction in the 60s. When films were first made, they were silent films, so which weren't so popular.
popular. But when sound and dialogue were added, it became more popular. Frankenstein was extremely popular, and that really helped put science fiction on its feet. With the advent of the space race, many Hollywood productions began to exploit the new national interest in space exploration. Star Trek is the undisputed most influential film in science fiction. The first line, "To boldly go where no man has gone before," is almost identical to a statement from a White House booklet on space produced after the Sputnik flight in 1957. The Russian crew members really reflect the space race's effects on the film. One of the most popular films was 2001: A Space Odyssey, written by Stanley Kubrick and Arthur Clarke. It portrayed space travel with a philosophical scope and was so good that Steven Spielberg called it the Big Bang of science fiction. It brought new realism to the genre with its groundbreaking visual effects and realistic portrayal of space travel, and influenced the genre with its epic story and transcendent philosophical scope. Kubrick's vision reveals technology as a competitive force that must be defeated in order for humans to evolve. Another big movie was Planet of the Apes, which was produced in 1968. There were many, many more movies, such as First Spaceship on Venus, Spaceman, 12 to the Moon, Visit to a Small Planet, Plan 9, and Lost in Space. Many of these films also represent American mindsets in the space age and the fear of the unknown frontier and the paranoia of communism. The film industry also explored the global impact that shooting rockets from space can have. This is really portrayed the best in Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, and Failsafe.
So Malka has given us a great overview of how the space race has pretty much affected all of our culture. And we're still feeling its effects and its legacy today. So David is now the next one to explore where we are today in terms of ideas that have been generated back in the 1960s. Well, if we can go to the moon, what about putting not just a man on the moon, but a space base on the moon? Or what about exploring or maybe even colonizing Mars or objects even further out in the solar system? So let me give you a little bit of information about David. David is the closer of our round of honor students' presentations today. He's a music education major and also music performance major who plays the flute and the oboe. He's currently a sophomore at GPC and plans to eventually pursue a master's degree from Kennesaw State or West Georgia. David will take up the idea of space colonization that was formulated in the 60s era and look at how much of a reality it has become today.
It is the year 2075. The underground population of the moon has reached over 3 million. How did they get here? Well, they are the unwanted of Earth. Examples of criminals, exiles, etc. Earth faces a revolt of these people to be free of its rule. Wait, what? How did this happen? When did this lunar colony come to be? This is the setting of The Moon is a Harsh Mistress by Robert A. Heinlein. It was published in 1966 and received a Hugo Award in 1967. The Hugo Award is the award for best science fiction novel published the previous year. Could the Moon, Mars, or one of Jupiter or Saturn's moons be possible for humans to colonize? It would be a different kind of experience to live on the Moon, Mars, or Europa. People dreamed of living on the Moon even before the first visit in 1969. This is more feasible than we think. One of the problems is that there is perception that to build a moon base would require some enormous quantity of money. Paul Spudis, a lunar geologist with NASA, said. That is simply not true. One of the things I looked at, and I did this about 2 years ago, is I specifically looked at how you can go back to the moon under the existing budget without any additional money for NASA, and you can do it. This is great news. The majority of scientists believe this to be a better option than living on the International Space Station, abbreviated ISS. On the ISS, astronauts experience microgravity, which is a complete lack of gravity. The effects on the human body are very daunting. A decrease in bone density and muscle loss are some side effects of the lack of gravity. There is, however, some gravity on the moon. This could offer a better alternative. So this is better for the human body. What's next? One of the first steps would be building the habitats. That would more than likely need to be accomplished with the aid of robotics. Sending the robots to begin building the base would be the first step. After that is accomplished, humans would need to be sent to continue the work and maintain the habitats. The beginning of this base would be a temporary for the people. It would be like a working vacation. Quote, I have thought that the initial return to the moon would consist of what I call a human-tended outpost, where people go there for extended tourism time. There's no permanent residence except in the sense of rotating cruise, end quote. Spudis told space.com. Hypothetically, a robot could use lunar dust and dirt, called regolith, to cover an inflatable dome. Humans mine Earth for building materials. The same could be done on the moon. Another money-saving feature is using the lunar material to make gases needed to sustain life on the celestial body. The consumables of air and water would largely be drawn from local resources, Spudis said. They would not be imported from the Earth, but everything else would be. So all of your high-tech equipment, all of your food, any kind of specialized needs, clothing, things like that, for the inhabitants would be brought from Earth, end quote. What about water? There's frozen water on the moon. It's not liquid water, but it is water nonetheless. This could be used to create a barrier from the radiation since there's a lack of atmosphere around the moon. The frozen water can be used to cover the domes to protect humans from the radiation and additionally be used for drinking. This would be the first step in colonizing the universe. This also gives human an outpost in which to venture further out to space. Once a stable colony is set up on the moon, the next logical place to go would be the closest planet, Mars. Mars, the red planet, is twice as far from the sun and just over half the size of Earth. Humans wouldn't be able to rely on supplies from the Earth to live on Mars due to the distance and it being costly. What other alternatives are there? Well, humans would need to learn to live off the land of Mars. This provides many potential problems. Mars is too cold. Liquid water does not exist on the surface. How can these obstacles be overcome? The red planet may be cold and dry, but it harbors a wealth of resources that pioneering astronauts could extract and exploit, said Robert Zubrin, president and founder of the Mars Society. For return trips to Earth, colonists can get oxygen from the thin carbon dioxide-rich atmosphere and make rocket fuel from it. Water is available on the planet, but not in liquid form. We now know that Martian soil has water in it, Zubrin told Space.com. Even at the equator, it's 5% water by weight. In the Arctic regions, it's 60% water by weight. And we've developed technology that can bake water out of that soil and make it available. The carbon dioxide and water that's available could make it possible to grow plants on the surface of Mars. There's also enough sunlight at the equator to help make this possible, along with the required ingredients to make fertilizer for the plants. The plants would be used not only for food, but also for clothing. Iron oxide and silicon oxide are also abundant on the surface of Mars. These are the ingredients required to make iron, steel, and glass. Between these materials and the water and carbon necessary to make plastics, a Mars colony could be fairly self-sufficient. Only complex items would need to be shipped from Earth, such as computer chips. Since these computer chips are much more lightweight, the cost would be greatly reduced as well. What about power and electricity on Mars? Solar panels and radioisotope thermoelectric generators, which convert the heat of radioactive decay into electricity, currently supply power to the rovers on Mars. This source of power is not significant enough to support an entire society or colony. What other options are there for a sustainable source of power? NASA is researching other possibilities, including batteries and storage for the fuel. What lies underneath the surface? People drill for oil on the Earth. What kind of fuel source could lie hidden on Mars? There's hot stuff underground, Zubrin said, noting that geothermal energy is the #4 power source here on Earth. After combustion, nuclear, and hydroelectric, we should be able to locate places where we can drill down and access geothermal heat, which might also give us liquid water as well, which would be convenient. This source could significantly improve the chances of survival and ease of living on the surface of Mars. The evidence of this came from a spacecraft that was orbiting the red planet. Cost is always a big factor on whether or not something will be successful. Beginning funding will more than likely be by independent wealthy individuals, governments, and foundations. This will continue to be the case until a source of trade commerce can be made with Mars. Potential sources include gold, precious metals, and intellectual property. Due to the harsher environment on Mars, people will be required to find new ways to grow crops and uses for robotics. This innovative technology could in turn be used in trade with Earth. It would take approximately 1 million people for a colony to function on Mars. It won't be easy, but everyone will have to pull their weight. Even at 1 million, you're really assuming an incredible amount of productivity per person, because you would need to recreate the entire industrial base on Mars, said Elon Musk. You would need to mine and refine all of these different materials in a much more difficult environment than Earth. There would be no trees growing. There would be no oxygen or nitrogen that are just there, no oil. In order to get 1 million people to Mars at 100 people per trip, it would take 10,000 trips. Also needed is about 10 cargo trips for each trip, making a total of 100,000 trips. All this could happen within the next 100 years. Elon Musk is currently researching and developing reusable rockets. Once these are fully developed, it will dramatically decrease the cost and make the 100,000 trips to Mars feasible. Once humans become a multiplanetary society, where will the next destination be within the solar system? The next logical place to look would be where liquid water is the most abundant. To date, it is thought that Europa has a large ocean beneath the icy surface. Europa, the sixth closest moon to Jupiter, is the smallest of the 4 Galilean moons. Galileo discovered Europa in 1610, and it orbits Jupiter in only 3.5 days. Europa has a diameter of 3,100 kilometers, which is slightly smaller than Earth's moon, but it remains the 15th largest object in the solar system. NASA thinks that Europa could one day be habitable for man. So Europa has a giant ocean beneath the surface, which is great, but what does that have to do with anything? Water is one of the main things astronomers look for in a world to be habitable. The next thing that is needed is oxygen. There's an abundance of oxygen in the ocean on Europa. This is great news. The most difficult thing about moving to Europa would be the distance. It is 600 million miles away at the closest, upwards of 1 billion miles away on the furthest. Mars is somewhat closer at 555 million miles away at the closest. By the point humans are ready to colonize Europa, they should be experts in how to get there more quickly, and technology will be much more advanced. Not only does Europa have a vast ocean twice the size of Earth's, but it is rich in oxygen. The radiation emitted from Jupiter poses a problem. In order for humans to survive, they would need to live deep enough in the ocean to avoid the radiation. This could be a first in underwater societies for humans. The surface of Europa is active, and water beneath the surface often arises due to an energy exchange between the two. This energy exchange can also be harnessed to provide power for the underwater society. There are many other variables to consider while living on this moon. However, by the time humans are ready to live there, technology will be advanced enough that perhaps communication from colony to colony will be instantaneous, and travel will be quicker, such as a few-hour drive to the beach as it is on Earth. Establishing colonies on other planets helps ensure the survival of the human race, but how far are people willing to go? Only the solar system has been discussed here. What about colonizing outside of the solar system? At present time, multi-generational ships that are unaffordable would be needed to get to the nearest neighbor, Alpha Centauri. Once colonies are established on other planets, will history repeat itself? Will humans slowly consume these resources and leave? Will humans continue to war with each other to free themselves from the rule of the home planet Earth? Scientists look to the cosmos for the answers on how long the human race can survive in a harsh universe.
Thanks for attending the session today about the big space adventure of the 20th century. And as you may have gathered from the many presentations of my honor students, we may have the next big space adventure of the 21st century on our hands. If you remember hearing about China and India and also Russia with new space missions and plans to go to the moon, and Mars, then the Mars Society, Mars One, Elon Musk here in the US. So we might be on the verge of our 21st space adventure. What an exciting time to be alive and be interested in astronomy. If you have any questions or any comments, feel free to email me at ulrike.lahaise@gpc.edu. Also, we have a YouTube channel for the popular STEM talks. Check it out. All of the past recordings have been posted there, and so will be the recordings from today as well. We're always looking for volunteer speakers, so shoot me an email if you're interested. And have a great day and enjoy the rest of the offerings of the 60s Symposium.